Hello, welcome to Fork in the Road. This is Rusty Gaylord, and I'm your host. Very happy to be with you here today. And you all know Fork in the Road is a conversation with interesting, smart, successful people about a fork in the road in their own life, something that has changed in a new direction they've taken as a result. So I'm happy to have today Tony O'Driscoll with us. He's at the Duke Fuqua School of Business and just super insightful, smart guy. And so as I bring Tony on, I also want to just say, please feel free to put your comments and ideas in the chat. Our system doesn't allow us to chat back, but we'd love to see your participation. And if you've got questions, we're happy to answer them live on the screen. So here's Tony. Welcome to Fork in the Road.
Thanks, Rusty. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump in. One of the, we were talking about forks in the road, and you said, well, quipping, or maybe not quipping. It's a life story that you've got dozens of them, all of these changes in directions. But one of the early kind of foundational ones was when your family moved from Ireland to Mauritius when you were young. So love to hear a little bit about that and what you took from that and how that has shaped your life.
Yeah, I think as we were talking just before the top here, it's an experience that really sticks with me and my sisters as well. We moved from Ireland to Mauritius when I was 13 years old. And Mauritius, for those who don't know, it is a small island nation off the coast of Africa, actually off the coast of Madagascar. So it's out in the middle of nowhere. And nothing could be more different between Mauritius and Ireland. Essentially, Ireland is, at the time I was growing up, largely Caucasian, and we spoke funny English. And when we moved to Mauritius, it was largely African. Ireland was agricultural, but more like farming, whereas Mauritius was all about sugar. Ireland was rainy and terrible weather, and Mauritius was gorgeous and beautiful coral reefs. So essentially, everything was different. You could argue that in some cases things were better, the weather was better, and so on and so forth. But the most important thing is things were different. And so there were mosquitoes, and you'd get welts because mosquitoes really liked me for some reason. So I found that my assumption base, everything that I kind of was just below my in my subconscious that I assumed to be true, was being called into question. And that's quite an exhausting experience, particularly when you're trying to get used to a new school. You don't understand the language. You don't understand the whether people in the playground are coming up to beat you up. You can't understand what they're saying, so you have to try to read their language. And so I learned at a very early age to try to make sense of what's going on without actually having language, because I didn't understand what people were saying. They spoke largely Creole there. And I think that's something I've carried with me for a long time, because people talk about reading a room. I tend to be quite good at doing that, only because I think it was at that age when I was 13, it was a matter of survival on the playground as to, are these people, looking to come beat me up, or are they going to be friendly with me? I don't know, and I can't quite understand it. So I think my father always says he has the itinerant bug, which means he likes to travel a lot, and that travel is the greatest teacher. And I do believe that that's the case, particularly if you put yourself into situations that you're not familiar with. And you approach it with humility and vulnerability to try to understand what it is about your own belief system or assumptions that you might call into question when you're thrown into a completely new place.
Mm-hmm. I love that because, you talk about belief systems, and, I've heard people talk about it as your BS. It's your belief system. But it's, it's this BS that we have in our mind, and to be uprooted and put into a totally new environment that challenges everything about the way people, even the way people interact, right? Like gestures and body language can mean different things in different cultures. 100%. So to have to relearn all of that, really, I understand, it's exhausting, but it can ultimately free you from this way of thinking of, this is the way the world works. I've heard you talk at other times about system 1 and system 2 thinking. And, it's that old system 1 thinking is that quick, intuitive, automatic way of thinking and interpreting the world. And you had to challenge that and learn different ways of processing the world. And I'm sure that has empowered you to see things differently than other people.
I do think so. I mean, at least I'm accused of that all the time, that I tend to come at things orthogonally for some reason. And I think that's part of what it is. I love the notion of, we eat our own dog food, or we kind of believe our own BS. Our belief systems are what they are, and they're forged by our experience. And so I think if you have, it's kind of, I think about it like a vinyl record. I think if you're in the same groove all the time, then those patterns become kind of really, really ingrained and harder to unlearn. Whereas if you kind of move your context, switch context, to call about it, context switching, and start to kind of learn how to unlearn and relearn in a more facile way. That doesn't mean that you don't have a core set of values that you adhere to, or a true north that you're kind of aspiring towards. I don't think it means that you don't have a sense of purpose, or you're not grounded in a value system. However, at the same time, I think some of the most powerful insights can come from when you're really called to question that purpose and value system by being put into a situation where they're called into question. And that doesn't happen if you don't consciously move outside your comfort zone, which is something a lot of people talk about, right?
So Tony, you've been in the executive education field for, I think, a decade now.
Yeah.
And clearly you've had your own experiences as well as a successful business leader.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, how much do you think that kind of context switching and that ability to unlearn and relearn and challenge your values and to kind of wade through those difficult times, how important do you think that is as a business leader for your business success, but also for your personal success?
I think they go hand in hand. I mean, since you're right, I've been very fortunate to work with leaders around the world for the last 20 years, and work with very talented educators in working with those leaders. And in that journey, I've had the opportunity to work with some of the best folks in the world on kind of generating a sense of purpose and how do we identify that. And so my own is essentially very simple. Took a while to get there. It's nurturing the leaders a brighter future needs. Now, that's just a couple of words, but let me tell you, Rusty, it took about a year to get that really honed down. Nurturing, not creating, not building, but nurturing, creating the surround system within which people's best selves can emerge. The leaders, right? I might actually amend that to the leadership now. That's one of the things I'm thinking about. We can amend our purpose ever so slightly. A brighter future needs. And I think if coming out of COVID and dealing with the situation in Ukraine, it doesn't bring clouds of gloom and doom into our space, I don't know what else will. And so what we need is leadership. We need leadership at every level and in all around the world to kind of bring us to a better future. So in a way, my purpose is almost doubling down now since that time. But I do remember very, very clearly when I was in Australia working with them. A group of leaders, somebody asked, what was your leadership born on date? Beer has a born on date. What's your leadership born on date? When is the point in time when you realized you were a leader? And in that discussion, we all kind of discovered that it happened accidentally. It's like we all tend to be somehow accidental leaders, or we're going for the brass ring of promotion because we want the promotion, but we don't understand what the responsibility of leadership is in getting that. And then we find ourselves again in this uncomfortable position, kind of like me showing up and I didn't realize that this promotion and whatever, perhaps extra money or so on and so forth, came with a span of control and dealing with personalities, and I'm really good technically, but that's not something I know how to do. So I think in every instance, finding ourselves in a context that we're unfamiliar with, and how then we can work through that, having a sense of purpose and building off of our core values is the only way forward, particularly as the world becomes increasingly complex and hard to figure out.
Yeah. So I'm curious if you noticed any common theme among yourself or between yourself and others as you had this conversation of that born on date, when it is that you became a leader. What is the theme of what changed? What was that hidden gateway that you walked through? Because we talked about this a little bit earlier, right? It's different to be managing a team and being a manager, but that is different from being a leader.
Yeah.
And it's it sounds to me like for all of you identify that in retrospect. You didn't necessarily identify it as you were going through it. So what is that gateway? What is the change?
I think for me, I can't necessarily speak for everybody else in the room, but for me, it was kind of an awakening that to me, there's only one requirement for leadership to happen anywhere in the world, right? There's all these different models on leadership and so on and so forth, but I think it actually literally boils down to one thing. There is no leadership without followership. So the only requirement for you to be a leader is that you have a follower. My dog is a leader when I'm walking the dog. I'm not walking the dog. The dog's actually walking me. Right? In that case, the dog kind of decides which path it wants to take, and I tend to follow. And I think that's one of the things is, oh my gosh, I am now being followed, and therefore there's a lot more scrutiny, if you will, in how you behave and what you do. You're not just accountable to yourself anymore. how, you know, what you do speaks far more loudly than what you say. And a lot of times, I think in leadership we might dictate change behavior, but not necessarily demonstrate it. And you're not going to get change behavior as a leader that has engendered followership unless you demonstrate. You know, as Gandhi would say, be the change you want to see in the world. And when you start to realize that, then you start to feel, you know, the opportunity or burden, whichever way you want to look at it. I tend to look at it as an opportunity to put your best self forward, because essentially, you know, those followers are looking to you, and that's an awesome responsibility. I mean that
It
in the
is.
truest sense, both awesome in terms of fantastic, and awesome in terms of, you know, it's a lot of responsibility to it.
It's a big responsibility, absolutely. Well, speaking of leaders and followers, just a quick shout out to those who are following this conversation. We've got a few chats from Vietnam, Virginia, and Boston. So feel free to chime in if you have questions or if there's something you want to hear about. One of the things I'm interested in, Tony, is you talked about you've got to demonstrate, you've got to lead by demonstrating, but you've got to, you can't tell people what to do. You have to demonstrate that. And which requires showing up as your best self, right? Being the best version of you. And I think it underlines this maxim that the whole organization is always going to be limited by the capabilities of the leader and the ability of the leader to step up and be their best self, to go through these challenges, to wrestle with the challenging questions and their purpose, and to come out on the other side of that. And I'm curious, as you know, from your experience and from the people that you work with, is there something, a necessary ingredient in order to be successful in going through that transition, being your best self, wrestling with those difficult things? Is there something that distinguishes the people who get through that really well from the people who don't?
I think it's a two-way street. So from my perspective, I think that in every organization, you know, a publicly owned company, you know, publicly traded company, to a private company, to an institution like an institution of higher education like Duke, where I work, I think that most organizations today run on discretionary effort. Discretionary effort is the work that people will do because they want to, not because they're told to. If your organization is essentially fueled by job descriptions and incentive structures that hold people into boxes and drive them, you know, on a daily basis to just do what they're told, you don't get this superpower that I call discretionary effort. Now, to unlock discretionary effort, though, that requires that the leader truly understands not only what their own purpose and value set are, but those that have chosen to follow. Because if you don't fully understand what it is that the individuals you have the privilege of working with aspire to from their own perspective and espouse to from a value set perspective, and you don't create the opportunity for them to exercise that, then you don't unlock that discretionary effort. Now, there's a lot of go slow to go fast there. In other words, if you have the pressure of quarterly earnings, let's say if you're in a publicly traded company and you've got to get things done, we tend to be very task oriented, right, rather than relationship oriented. My own experience is I really feel that you want to build relationships first and truly understand people's aspirations, people's value set, and then find the fit for them to flourish, to truly you know, blossom in that context. And if you can do that, while it takes longer in the short term, then the system kind of operates itself because it's running on discretionary effort. People are doing what they want to, not what they're told to. Also, I believe in a world where things are quite complex, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen in the future. So you can't kind of organize the tracks ahead of time and say you will be doing this at this point in time. So you need to rely a little bit more on allowing individuals in your group to make decisions closer to the point of need. And that involves trust, but it also involves making sure you have the right people in the right places to do it.
So
I think that's
a lot of the people I work with and a lot of the things that I hear from people they're not the top level in their organization. They're more they're the middle layer of leaders and managers and directors and VPs and so on. And one of the things I tend to hear is, you know, I would love to do that. I would love to really engage my team in that way, but that's just not the culture of our company. You know, you also hear this sometimes around psychological safety. Well, it's not a psychologically safe environment. And, you know, while I totally understand that an organization has its culture, I'm also of the belief that each person has their ability to shape and influence the sphere around them, including their team if they're leading others. And I'm curious for you, if you were someone to come to you and say, hey, this organization doesn't really, it's all about delivering on the values and hitting the quarterly earnings, and like, how can I be an effective leader in this organization when there's so much emphasis on delivery, which I would say, by the way, having spent the bulk of my career in the corporate world, there's a huge focus on delivering the work, less on relationship and building that trust and unlocking that kind of discretionary effort.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you tell a leader in that position, even in this environment that seems to be counter to this approach of building relationship and unlocking discretionary effort? How would you advise someone to think about approaching their leadership in that kind of environment?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in what you just asked there, Rusty. So see if I can start that. The first thing is recognizing that the world is far more complex than we often want to give it credit for. And so if we're in a really complex environment, then none of us is as smart as all of us. And therefore, the broader perspective we have with the right set of people who have diversity of perspective, the higher the likelihood that we will find the path forward, because we're bringing discretionary effort and broader perspective to the problem. So you don't want 10 people in the room that see things the same way, because then you can fall back into the groove we talked about earlier on. I'll go back to Mary Parker Follett on this. You mentioned psychological safety, and I think that's also key. But she said back in 1914, I think, leadership is not defined by the exercise of power, but by the capacity to increase the sense of power among those led. So it is not kind of a top-down, I know exactly what to do, where are we going type thing, right? Even on execution. But it's more about, we all know what we're aspiring to do, and you have the accountability and the autonomy to get it done. Now that's quite a different power system than if you think about regular power systems of reward power, position power, coercive power that sits in a traditional hierarchy. It's like, did you get it done, Randy? Did you get, or did you get it done, Tony? Did you get it done, Mary? We're going to have a meeting with Randy, Tony, and Mary, and we're going to kind of, we put a cadence call in, and we're going to keep cracking the whip. There's an important part to that in execution, don't get me wrong. But 70% of execution efforts fail. Execution means one of two things. It means to do or to kill. And unfortunately, in an organizational context, a lot of times things get killed, not because they're not the right thing to do, but because there's not that discretionary effort to fulfill. And if we over push on the outcome variables of whatever, production quantity or failure, reduce failure rates and so on and so forth, people just start to hit a wall because they lose the sense of why, they lose the sense of what's going on. So I really feel, again, it's if we can ground ourselves in a sense of purpose, if we can show situational humility. I don't know exactly how we're going to get through this, but I do know this team can, and together we will. And how we get there will be determined by us, and it'll be decided by the person who at the right time has the best insight to take us forward, and we're in it together. I feel that kind of leadership system, if I may, not just leader pointing the way, but leadership system, will find a way forward. And in these highly more unpredictable times, we'll know when to pivot and when to move and when to weave. So it's a bit more like jazz than it is like orchestra, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So leadership itself shifts. It's not that you don't have capability, but that capability kind of, the ball of leadership gets moved around perhaps a little bit more fluidly, dealing with the situation on the ground.
Which of course requires whoever is at the top to welcome that kind of structure, whereas a lot of people who made it to the top through a command and control kind of approach are very open to sharing the ball. They say, hey, I earned the ball, I want to hold it.
And that's the irony, Rusty, is that if you have been successful in moving up the hierarchy, and now you're trying to kind of put into place a leadership system that kind of leans into who you know, what you know, kind of relationship and expertise rather than position and coercion. The irony is it pretty much requires that leader to step back, show vulnerability, demonstrate that failure is acceptable, and try, right? If you think about it, Roger Martin talks about this a lot, and I think it makes a whole lot of sense. He thinks about companies as decision factories, right? That's what they do. They're decision factories, and the number of decisions that can get made in the right direction will then predict your success. Well, in a hierarchical structure, in a world that's even more and more complex today, what happens is all those decisions get pushed on up and on up and on up. And so every leader then suddenly has kind of like bet the company decisions coming at them at a rate faster than they can actually consume them. And then everybody else is sitting around waiting. So the weight of the system just doesn't work because no one person can do this. So if you can distribute the decision making to the point of interface with the person who best knows what's going on, driven and grounded in a shared sense of purpose and core set of values, then you can kind of distribute the decision making and trust that the right calls are being made. I'll give you an example. I worked for a large insurance company, and that company changed their purpose from helping people manage risk and recover from the hardship of unanticipated loss, which is essentially what they do, they're actuaries, to we make your world a safer place. Now, if our purpose is to make your world a safer place, and somebody who is 85 years old calls and her insurance lapsed because her husband died the year before, and now her house has been flooded, do you honor the fact that she had been a customer for 20 years and help her put her house back together? And do you have a leadership system where the person at the call center feels that they have the right to make that decision? That's where it becomes really, really, really real, Rusty, right? Can you imagine?
Oh, yeah.
At some point in time, if everybody does that, the company goes bankrupt.
Yep.
See? So that's
and being comfortable delegating that decision
until you get into the actual concrete. That's a real concrete example that we discussed, as part of a leadership system that's principle based.
I would love to drill down on this, but I want to switch gears slightly because I have a question about you talking. We were talking earlier about, hey, if you're going to be a leader, it requires followers, right? So leading fundamentally is about influence and driving direction, having people sign on to that and move with you. So you discover that in retrospect, right? Looking back at that point in which you believe you transitioned from doing the work to becoming a leader. For someone who's before that transition, for someone who's aspiring to make that transition and saying, hey, I want to become, whether it's a director, VP, a principal, whatever the title is in your organization, I'm aspiring to that next level. What would you say to that person who wants to grow to that next level, wants to demonstrate the ability to operate at that level and get the opportunity for the promotion and the actual title? What would you say to them about what they need to be thinking about and working on to reach that level?
I think that's an easy one for me. You have to let go to grow. And so in most organizations, when you're making the transition from being an exemplary expert employee, whatever, engineer who knows everything about whatever, switch mode power supplies or nuclear energy, or, best salesperson in the world who can build the right relationships, to then moving to having P&L responsibility, having a span of control, having 10 times more work to get accomplished, and also doing so profitably within margin tolerances or customer sat tolerances. Like everything shifts, right? Now, the irony is that it's the old Marshall Goldsmith, right? What got you here won't get you there. Everything that you did to get you to the opportunity to be promoted was kind of driven by your own standards and the work that you do and how you hold yourself accountable. Whereas when you move up, what you will invariably find, this is based on research that I've done for a large consulting firm, is that the work that you have past your desk, you might not feel is up to snuff. But if you fall into the trap of going back in and trying to do 10 people's work to the level that you used to do it to, you will never move forward, right? So then it's about building the capability in others to work to a particular standard without falling back into the work. And that is what I've found to be one of the most difficult things to do, is because sometimes you're going to have to let something through that you wouldn't necessarily want your name on. And many, many times I find, particularly those who are really, really, really capable in their kind of predetermined field, whatever that is, engineer, find it very difficult to make that transition, because now you're seeking leverage. You're looking to work across a whole number of human beings, and that work may not be because the person's not necessarily capable. It's they just had a baby, or there was a loss in the family. There could be any huge number of reasons why the work is not, quote unquote, to the level that you want. So I think that that's one of the big things, is this notion of letting go to grow, and kind of nurturing, again, leaders through this type of environment to allow them to become their best selves. Right?
Yeah. I would love to continue this for an extended period of time, but we're going to wrap up. There is so much great insight that you shared during this time, Tony. Thank you. If people wanted to reach out to you, can they do that on LinkedIn? What's the best way to make a
Absolutely.
connection
Yeah.
with you?
LinkedIn. All my information is up there. So please feel free to reach out. Happy to chat anytime.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining Fork in the Road.
Oh, I look forward to many more forks. I think that that's the best thing. I love that you call it this, Rusty, because I think those of us who navigate the forks or the road less traveled, as M. Scott Peck might say, I think end up learning more.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks.